Hey guys, I have a pretty unfortunate announcement to make this week. It's been a weird couple months. Some of it very good and some of it very very terrible. And this is the latter. As some of you may already know, our beloved cat Lucy has crossed the Rainbow Bridge. She was 19 years old. Well, she was at least 19 years old. She was with me for 19 years, and she was a stray, so she actually may have been a little bit older. We're not sure exactly. But she has crossed the Rainbow Bridge, and I know a lot of you are familiar with Lucy. You may have seen the comic Lucy and Ron, or you may just know Lucy from past shows and live streams and whatever else. She was an incredible cat. I wrote an extensive tribute as well as thoughts on grief and loss and loss of a pet on my Substack. So if that is of value to you, maybe you lost a furry loved one yourself, or just any loved one, really. Romplacone.substack.com if you want to check that out. And Lucy, you loved and were loved your entire life, and now we will miss you for the rest of ours. Please wait for us, and in the meantime, enjoy your time over the Rainbow Bridge. All right. Enjoy this week's episode, y'all. And if you got a furry loved one or any loved one, please just give them an extra hug or pet for me, please. All right. Episode 97. Angeline Mirenda. Angeline Mirenda is a sex educator. I saw her Hollywood Fringe Show, AP Sex Education. Not only was it entertaining, but also incredibly informative. She draws the connection between sex ed in the U.S. and imperialism, racism, and capitalism. Ready to talk about sex? Please welcome to the show, Angeline Mirenda. Angeline Mirenda, how are you?
I'm so good. How are you, Ron?
It's good to see you again, and congrats on a wonderful run at the Hollywood Fringe. I am still sort of in post-Fringe sadness. Like, I miss it.
Oh, that dopamine crash, man.
I know. I miss it. I wanna go back. I wanna go to the Broadwater and whatnot.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's crazy.
It was a fun.
It's like, I don't know what your experience was. For us, it was like, there was all the pre-production preparation, and then we hit June, and it was just 30 days of like nothing but Fringe. That was my entire life. So I think on the other side of that, for a lot of us, like, you're slowing back down, you're going back to normal life. There is definitely, for me, like an adrenal crash that I was prepared for, but it doesn't mean that it's any fun.
No, totally. I mean, yeah, Fringe was, it's its own animal, and it was a very significant, and it was the entire month, really. I mean, technically it wasn't, but really it was.
Yeah.
And it was a fun time. So let's get into it. I found you because I saw your Fringe show.
Yeah.
AP Sex Education.
Mm-hmm.
And I usually don't ask this question first, but in your case, I feel like it's the best place to start before we kind of get to your origin story. How exactly would you describe what you do?
What a great question. Okay, so AP Sex Ed stands for Advanced Placement Sex Education, kind of a riff on if you were in high school and you were taking like advanced placement classes. The idea was that the curriculum was going to be like a little bit more in depth or involved, perhaps, than like your basic English class or whatever. So that's kind of what we're poking fun at lovingly. Our pitch is basically for Fringe. We were a 1 hour comedy that uses improv to teach sex education for adults. We do this through what I like to call the sluttiest media vehicle of all time, PowerPoint. So that format was called the PP party, as in the PowerPoint presentation party. But AP Sex Ed is a little bit of a larger umbrella. So it's kind of like my little sex ed baby. And we want to be able to expand and do other things with it, all kind of within this parameters, or like the fence of we're using like art and comedy to teach sex education for a slightly older, like young adult audience.
So you would say like you're a sex education specialist or teacher, or like how would you designate it exactly?
So the Fringe Show was actually my capstone project to get certified to teach sex education. In the United States, you don't have to be certified to teach sex ed, which I think explains many of our experiences.
Sure.
But for me, it was like when I decided that this was something I was interested in pursuing, it felt important to me that I was doing that responsibly, and that I was really making sure that I had some guidance about like where to get good information from, because information about sex in the media, in our culture, in academia is bountiful. And sometimes it takes time to like figure out how to get the skills to kind of parse through that. So the capstone project has been sent off. I sent them a recording of one of the shows. And if that is then approved of by the Sexual Health Alliance, is the program that I'm going through, then I am, yes, technically certified to teach sex ed.
Well, I wish you all the best in that. I thought it was a wonderful show, and also like I love we're going to dive more into it because some of the points you made and some of the things you brought up, I really, really loved. But I'll give you something first before we dive into more. You want to know what my sex education was?
Oh, I love it. Everyone always is like, do I have a story for you? And I love hearing people's stories. Tell me.
I hope this is a memorable one for you. And if it's not, you can tell me. But here it goes. All right. So I went to an all-boys Catholic high school.
I went to a co-ed Catholic high school.
Okay. All right. So my sex ed, I'm using quotes, everybody. My sex ed was... it was in religion class, first of all. It wasn't even in health class. It was literally in religion class. And our teacher was a priest, and he literally one day, there was no lessons, by the way. One day he randomly just gave us an anatomy test about, female genitalia, male genitalia, testes, you name it. It's all there. He just gives that test to us. And we're thinking, well, what is this? And we all take it. And here's the interesting thing. I actually did fine on it. And the reason I did fine was because my parents, I guess they knew that I wasn't going to get sex ed in high school, technically. And they didn't want to deal with it, which I can't say I blame them. But so they actually sent me to this this class. Like there was this evening where I did this like workshop, and it was basically just sex ed for like preteens or teenagers, where you just learned that stuff basically. So I had that experience. So I remembered it from that workshop. So I did good on this test. And then the conclusion, my sex ed isn't over, though, at Catholic school. So the conclusion of our sex ed was after we took the pop anatomy test that none of us knew about, were prepared for, or were taught anything about. The priest told everybody our scores and then roasted all the students who did bad. He literally just goes, well, some of you, I'm a priest. I don't know anything about females because I'm not allowed to. What's your excuse? That was literally my sex education. And then, like I said, I did okay. So he goes, Placone seems to know this stuff. That was my sex ed.
That is simultaneously like there are parts of it that like make me like cringe inside, and then there are parts of it that are weirdly like in a very roundabout way kind of wholesome about it too,
I hope it was. I mean, you gotta laugh about it, I think, but I I hope you
That's a
can
great
use that at
story.
some point. I really do. I hope that finds its way into your work. And I
Oh my
hope have
gosh.
you had any other stories like that? My sex education was an anatomy test out of nowhere, and then a Catholic priest roasted the class after. Like, am
No,
I a first?
you were a first. Yeah. What a comedy roast was not like the conclusion that I saw coming from that story when we first began.
That was how it ended. He literally, because he like, and he announced the scores. He goes, "Oh, so and so got an F. I guess he doesn't have a girlfriend." Like it was ridiculous.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous. Kind of hilarious, kind of horrible, and yeah, quite an experience.
Wow, man. I think look, I have like a whole thing that we can talk about later about the ways in which we don't prepare people with this information and then expect them to just know it somehow. But I think the part of it that like makes me giggle and like warms my heart a little bit is that the lesson from all of this wasn't you shouldn't know these things. The lesson was, even if we're going to be irresponsible and not give you the information, you should still figure out the information at some point, which is really not the approach that all, because I went to Catholic school too, not the approach that a lot of Catholic schools take.
Yeah, no, it was something. So, well, before we dive further there, let's get to the starting line now. So, where did you grow up?
I'm also interested where you grew up and went to school, because sex education varies like state by state too a lot. I grew up just outside of San Francisco in the East Bay. Fremont and Hayward were basically my hometowns. And then I came down to Orange County for college I'm going to date myself here a little bit, '08. And then a couple years after I graduated college, I moved out to Los Angeles, and I've been here ever since. I think it's the most beautiful little madhouse on the planet.
I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So yeah, Rust Belt, Northeast. Like a lot of Irish, Italian, Catholic.
Yeah,
stuff
we're
going
Italian.
on.
Yeah.
Yep, same, and yeah, so that's where I grew up. And yeah, went to Catholic school for 12 years. So yeah, paid my dues. I think I don't practice anything. I guess I am by definition an atheist because I don't acknowledge any supreme being. But I feel like just in case they're right, I paid my dues. I got my stripes. Like, yeah, you paid your dues. You're in.
I'm fully on the other side of that, where I'm like, any good karma that I accrued, if that's the system in which we all live in Catholic school, I have since squandered like 5,000 times. There is no way they're letting me in those pearly gates, man.
Well, so what kind of led you to this field?
Yeah. This is like such an interesting question because so many things. So I think kind of like the truncated summary I give now is that I also went to Catholic school growing up. The sex education I received was actually, I think, gentler than a lot of people's because it was Bay Area Catholicism, which means that like it's in a pretty liberally slanted part of California. By proxy, like that's going to creep into how things get taught. So my parents were relatively sex positive. We weren't like, they were not out there, teaching me about my vulva at age 3. But like, certainly when I was a young adult, they acknowledged that they have sex, that like they would make a light joke about it now or then. So I knew that was something that happened. They were very open-minded when I came to them at the age of like 19, I want to say, and basically said, I have a serious boyfriend now. I'd like to start having sex. And my mom was like, okay, then we need to make an appointment and, talk to a doctor about birth control. So there was not this sense of like, oh, this isn't something that we touch or talk about. I grew up reading like horny fan fiction. And so I think that there was like always kind of this vested interest in sex from a young age. I was a dancer, so I was very comfortable in my body growing up. And then I am in the arts. And when COVID hit, I no longer had a job to go to because we all shut down. And I was thrust into therapy out of necessity because my mental health was not in a good place. And my therapist eventually was like, I think you need to find something outside of performing that feels satisfying to you, so that when you're in those gaps between gigs, you don't feel like your time in your life is being wasted and you still feel like you're doing something with purpose. And we talked about, she was like, I think you might be interested in therapy. I am, but I'm not actually interested in becoming a therapist. So an educator was kind of where I landed. My best friend, Andrew, and I had a sex positivity podcast a couple years before that. So it was something that I'd already kind of started to talk about more publicly. And then I found this like basically this program online where you could asynchronously learn, so that I could be holding down a job and doing, performance and production stuff still, and also be studying and like working towards the accreditation.
That's awesome. Well, what were you doing before the pandemic hit? Like, were you a dancer with a troupe, or what exactly were you doing?
A lot of freelancing. Musical theater was like kind of my bag out here.
Okay.
Yeah. So I went from gig to gig. I was teaching for a long time, and then that's like actually really very exhausting. So there was a point where that I was like, I can't do that anymore. And that, I think the pandemic hit like a little bit after I had stopped teaching. So I was just freelancing at that point. I wrote for like a new parents blog for a while. I did like SEO content and stuff like that online. And then I nannied during the pandemic. And then after the pandemic, I worked as a production assistant on Grey's Anatomy for a season and a half too.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So what is wrong with sex education in the U.S.?
Okay, this is now down to a pitch too, which makes me feel good that we've gotten to the point where I can be succinct about this. So the words I always use whenever I'm talking about this is that sex education in the United States, from its inception basically, has always been preventative and prescriptive in nature, meaning that it is all about teaching us the pitfalls of sex, the consequences of sex, so STIs, pregnancy, if that's not something you're interested in. People will talk about the emotional consequences of sex a lot, which I have big beef with in the way that gets discussed. And then also prescriptive in nature, in terms of this is the kind of sex that we are all meant to be having. Typically, this comes to us in the package of within like a monogamous, long-term romantic relationship. And that sex outside of those parameters is basically like not to be touched. And if you're doing it outside of those parameters, you're not doing it correctly. I think like immediately this is my mental image is like shot putting a sperm over the finish line, because it just like the sex education jumps over all of these things in lieu of like the sperm is what we're concentrated on. That's the thing that we have to talk about. And we miss things like pleasure. We miss things like gender identity, expression, sexuality, connection, consent, authentic consent, how we explore our bodies, what that means to us, how different it is around the world. And like really, to me, sex is often a point of connection and expression, self-discovery. And none of that, I think, gets its due in the kind of sex education that we mostly have all grown up with.
Let me ask you this on like basically everything you just said there, because for a while I was doing, and this might be something you're familiar with. I was doing like the NACA circuit, like the college activities stuff, like as a comic. And then I actually also had a speaking program too that I did for a couple years. And there would be a lot of, sex, like sexuality speakers and things like that. So it seemed to me, both as a student and then also, being a part of NACA and seeing, what these types of speakers would cover and what they would talk about, it seems like there was this huge disconnect where you were taught a certain thing in middle school and high school. Then you would get to college, they'd be like, so everything you were told before is bullshit. And here's actual information that is used. And you would just kind of think, I mean, even back then, I'm like, why didn't they just take this approach the entire time? And I get it. You need to ease into it a little more. The way you speak to college kids probably isn't going to be the same way you introduce things to middle school kids, nor should it be. But to kind of have this basic abstinence only for until 18, and then all of a sudden switch completely once people are in college, because you're recognizing that that's just not the real freaking world. It just seems very counterproductive to me.
Well, counterproductive, and also then we're having to take time to like undo some harm, right?
Sure.
Like that's
Yep.
I got very lucky that I think I skated through a sex education program in high school that was not super shamey. It was, in terms of like every layer I had to wear, this was in our dress code, had to have sleeves. I couldn't wear like a camisole with something over it, like a little sweater over it. Every single layer I wore had to have sleeves on it. And if it didn't, I could get dress coded. To which my father's response was like, should you not be wearing a bra then? Like, that's not a logical way to be like going about this. However, like the sex ed I received in high school, I remember my teacher saying, I'm going to level with you. This feels good. I don't think you're old enough to be pursuing it responsibly yet. We should talk about like pressure and how to know when we're emotionally ready for this. But that's very different than some of the people that I have spoken to, read about, heard from, whose experience was more about the shame of it and the stigma of like, there are these reports, I mean, congressional reports of federally funded programs in the United States between like the 80s and the early 2000s that found that there were programs that we were putting tax money towards that were telling young people basically, if you have sex before marriage, then you're basically like used chewed gum or like sweaty used gym socks or an Oreo. They would like dunk it in water a bunch of times and then they'd be like, do you see how soggy this Oreo is and how it's like not good anymore? Well, that's you if you have sex outside of marriage. And what like an awful thing to be drilling into people's head about something that is probably inevitably going to be a really natural part of a lot of their lives. And so I am with you that I it's astounding to me that that's still kind of our approach, even when we are now starting to acknowledge as people get older, like, oh, okay, everything we told you prior to this was bullshit. Now we're going to get down to the real brass tacks of it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, I remember there was another thing where we watched this video where it was this abstinence only speaker, but they were very eloquent about it. So it was a little bit disguised that was what it was. If that makes sense. Yeah. And they compared it to regifting something. Like if you have sex with somebody else before you're married, where you're giving away that gift and then you're regifting. And even back then I was like, what a dumb metaphor. That's the most ridiculous thing. And honestly, it was more pointed towards women than men.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yes.
I think there's such like an interesting aspect of that too, that is embroiled in kind of like capitalism and consumerism and colonialism, which is like kind of the area of sex ed now that I'm really starting to explore more, is the history of sex ed in the United States and how tied into like racism a lot of our sex education kind of is, and gender essentialism, so like a form of sexism and misogyny, because this idea that like, oh, you're regifting something. Well, I am a woman who primarily wears things that are regifted. I thrift. I am part of like radical clothing swaps in which like, you know, everyone shows up and we just exchange clothing. I'm part of like a buy nothing neighborhood group where we all change clothes with each other, because if it's not like, if it still has use in it, why would I throw it out? What a deeply wasteful thing to be doing. So this idea that like, oh, don't regift it suggests that something is only precious to us or valuable to us if it's new and like bought or given once, right? And I take a lot of umbrage with that.
That's reason number 1,000,005 why that analogy is really freaking stupid.
Yeah.
I never even thought of that one. But, so I actually wanted to talk to you about some of the stuff you just brought up there. In your show, you drew the parallels between the way we go about sex education and capitalism and imperialism and a few other isms. I was wondering if you could expand on some of that, whatever you want to share.
Sure. Okay, so I think you saw the sociology show, is that correct?
AP Sex Ed was what I saw.
So yeah. I based on what you're saying, yes. We, like, side note, we did 5 different shows throughout Fringe, so every single one of our shows was a different lecturer.
All right. I'm not sure which one I got then.
I think you got sociology, because that's the one where I really concentrated on that.
Okay.
So, yeah, sex education as like a formal institution in the United States started in like early 20th century, basically. Prior to that, there was not this concept of adolescence. It was kind of like you were a child and then you were an adult, and that in-between period wasn't really structured very much in terms of like developmental psychology. Then what happens is, because there's like a lot of industrialism happening, because the job market is kind of shifting, and like the structure of society and where people live and how they live in terms of families is shifting, a lot of young people are starting to move out of like more rural areas into urban areas. And this causes a panic in like some of the families in terms of, we don't feel like they're adult enough to be sent out into the world yet. There are going to be other people out there influencing them. This is also happening around a time in which there was an influx of immigration to the United States. If you look a little bit more into that immigration, it's like our people, Ron, who the Italians are coming over. There's more Russian immigration. There's some more Chinese immigration. And there is this kind of like sentiment that goes with that I think we see still peddled today, that these people are foreigners. They're coming over here. They're going to be polygamous. They're going to be engaged in incest. They're going to be promiscuous. They will not be able to control their sexual drives. This is all rooting from an idea that underlies a lot of kind of like colonialism and imperialism, which is that there are classes of people who are going to be more naturally, like their natural state is going to be of a higher elevation than other people. So this is like essentialism is what we're talking about, that some are born with a better moral character. They are born more intelligent. They are born kinder, more deserving of wealth, prosperity, whatever. As that trickles down, we see that kids are moving away from their families and they're starting to get married later than they were beforehand. Puberty is also hitting a little bit earlier than before, possibly because of like some dietary changes. And so what happens is suddenly there is this breach in time between like when someone is considered a child and an adult, in which they are feeling sexual urges, and yet they don't have like a socially acceptable container to practice them in, which would be marriage, because they're getting married later. So adolescence becomes this kind of idea that people start talking about. And with it comes a panic, as it always does, about the youth and who is going to guide them and how are we going to keep them safe. Often, really what people mean when they talk about that is, how are we going to keep them safe from themselves, which is tragic to me that like that's how we're structuring that and looking at that. And so ASHA swoops in. ASHA is called the American Social Hygiene Association. That's what it stands for. It is one of the first like organizations that really formalizes an idea of sex education and says, we want to start teaching this publicly. We want to move it into schools. As that's happening, there is also like some wartime stuff going on. And then we find that sex education also actually parallels war a lot, because when soldiers are going overseas and they're not educated about things like venereal diseases, which is what they were called at the time, specifically at that moment, they were talking about syphilis and gonorrhea. If those soldiers go overseas, and again, from these like savage people, these lower people, the other, the not us, the not Americans, if they get STIs from them, then it's going to weaken the troops. So they decide to start teaching sex education within the confines of the army. They also start intellectually testing their recruits in the army. And what the findings of those tests basically say is, Black people and new immigrants to the United States are always scoring very low on intelligence tests. This is one of those situations in which like people are not being totally comprehensive and honest about the data, right? There are many, many factors, socioeconomic factors, learning opportunity factors that go into something like that are not being addressed. Instead, they default again to essentialism. These people are stupid, is what they're telling us. So we have to teach them in a very blunt fashion. And so sex education for the recruits becomes pretty blunt. Back on land, what they find is that actually the civilian population has a higher level of venereal diseases than the recruits. So then they're saying, well, now we need to start teaching this more broadly on land in the United States. So they start doing that. Penicillin eventually comes into the picture. That becomes, so like if you don't know, syphilis and gonorrhea are bacterial infections. They're viral and there are bacterial STIs. There are also parasitic ones. Syphilis and gonorrhea are bacterial ones, meaning if you catch them, it can be cured with a round of antibiotics. You just have to be testing, in an appropriate time manner so as not to do damage to your body if you catch them. So when that occurs, there is pushback against formalized sex education because from the start, the parents have always basically been saying, well, we don't want you teaching our children that. That's not your business. It's our business to teach them morals and values about sex. So now sex educators pivot. And the thing that they pivot from is this like preventative idea of sex education to the prescriptive idea of sex education. They need a new boogeyman. And that boogeyman becomes the threat to the nuclear family. This is all frustrating to me to read because I hear so much of these sentiments echoed again and again, kind of like throughout history. And so much of it, I think, parallels a lot of how we talk about sex, race, relationships, gender today. So there is this idea of the threat to the nuclear family kind of in like the 40s and 50s that starts to take hold. That becomes the thing that sex educators are helping to empower your children against, basically. And so they start talking about how to have sex within the confines of a monogamous relationship and the importance of pursuing monogamy and the importance of with that threat to the nuclear family comes this idea of kind of like a threat to gender and our sense of gender. And so prior to that, there had been this idea that femininity and masculinity were sort of inherent traits in us. And as culture starts to shift, they start to talk about it as actually perhaps these are aspirational traits. They're our destiny that we should be moving towards, but they're not necessarily things that are bred into us. So we have to teach children how to pursue them and how to achieve them if we want them to be good citizens in the world and productive citizens in the world. Productivity actually comes up a lot in the way that we talk about teaching children and teaching adolescents and preparing them for the world, which is a symptom of a system that, capitalism is suggesting to us that our significance, our value, our dignity as human beings is directly tied to the means that we produce in the world. So that kind of takes hold, and that's called family living education, FLE, or family life education. That is kind of probably the seedling of what you and I received when we were in school. There is a lot of talk about like family planning. There's a little bit more concentration on connection and relationships, which I think we should be teaching those skills. Those are wonderful, soft skills that are very important to all of us in life. But certainly I am wary of kind of the things that shaped that seed and the soil perhaps that it was planted in for us.
Quick side note before I get to the so that actually spawned another memory that I have. So we were told, the way we were raised, like you're not allowed to use condoms. Mm-hmm. And again, all boys school. Mm-hmm. So we were talking candidly about condoms because it was applicable to every one of us. And somebody said, and again, it was a priest answering these questions, someone who has never been married and presumably never will be. They go, well, how are we, like, we're told that we're allowed to have sex for pleasure once we're married. Like, we don't have to always be procreating. How do we do that without, protection in some cases? And the explanation was the family planning thing. And the priest said, well, there's times when the woman is not fertile and you can just, have sex. And the student goes, well, when is that? And the priest goes, this was his answer. She'll know. I swear to God. Yes, she'll know. That was what he just ask her. That was his that was his cell.
Oh, then meanwhile,
it's amazing.
On the female end of that,
I'm sorry you had to hear that, but that is what happened.
It just makes me laugh because, like, I was not taught that. I was not taught the nuance of like how to properly track a cycle and kind of understand when you're slightly more, slightly less fertile within that. Yeah. So
there is that part of it, but it was executed in the worst way imaginable. But no, so well, let me ask you this. Getting to what's going on now in the world, like what kind of space do you feel like we're in now? Because I don't know exactly where you are politically, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say we're probably pretty much aligned. I think that eugenics is on the rise in this country, and I find it beyond disturbing.
Okay, so eugenics is also a central part of how sex education in the United States got started. There was an idea that the wrong kind of people were having too many babies and that we should be pushing the right kind of people to have more babies. You can go back to historical documents, and I'm not kidding, find like strong advocacy for eugenics in those documents, including in the Los Angeles Downtown Library, like in our Central Branch, there is a copy of like a 1960s law, I want to say, that I went down and looked at, and multiple times throughout it, they specifically are talking about eugenics as if it is a positive thing for us to be pursuing. So yes, 100%. That is something that has always kind of run parallel to the idea of who should and should not be allowed to have sex. I am someone who thinks that pleasure is actually deeply political. I have been trying to figure out how to articulate this point with kind of like the information that I have received and continue to like pursue and receive. I think where I've landed, speaking in draft, probably not a perfect way to say this, but to me, my question is, if we are teaching people that they cannot trust themselves about the basic act of giving their own body pleasure, of the stewardship and autonomy of their own body, and of the kinds of people that they form close, perhaps the closest for some people, intimate relationships with, if we are telling them, you are not smart enough to figure that out for yourself, you have to look to us for the answers about that, what other kinds of things are they then by proxy going to assume that they have to look outside for the answers to? You know, we're teaching them fundamentally that their own sense of trust in themselves, their own instinct, their own ability to think critically and question, we're teaching them that those things don't have a place in our world order. And that if you want to be given this idea of like companionate love and marriage and someone who is going to be with you romantically and love you for all of you who you are, you know, long term for a lot of people is the goal, then you have to kind of shun those sides of yourself and stick to this idea of what we think sex and marriage is supposed to be as like educational institutions, religious institutions, governmental institutions, etc.
What countries, just in your research, what countries would you say have a better... Well, actually, let me reframe that, because if I just say better, you could probably say most of them. So instead, let's go for like... like which countries do you think are kind of leading the way, comparatively speaking, on how sex education should be?
Yes. Okay, hold on. I'm pulling this up real fast to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. Yes. Okay.
No worries.
Sweden and the Netherlands are two countries where we see certainly more comprehensive sex education and less panic kind of like embedded in the way that it's spoken about. I read this fantastic book called When Sex Goes to School, and it talks about sex education in the United States and kind of the evolution of it over time. And specifically, the public's reaction to that is kind of the focus of the book. And they talk in that book and in many other books about sex history about how in Sweden and the Netherlands specifically, there is just, it's a more frank conversation. It happens earlier. There is no judgment passed. Someone comes in who is a professional who has, some expertise on the matter, and students are allowed to ask questions, and those questions are answered in a very matter-of-fact way. Parents talk to their children more consistently, more openly. There are examples of, and this happens in the United States too, certainly, but like I can't tell you like with hard facts and data, maybe it is a little bit more prevalent there to see sexuality in younger relationships not being as secretive within families, because there is a space to kind of like talk about that and work through that together.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the Nordic countries are just so interesting to me on so many levels. And when I was in grad school, I studied media policy,
Okay.
and the country that I would say is really leading the way there compared to pretty much anywhere else in the world, and every press freedom index that isn't some FBI propaganda supports this is Norway.
Yeah.
Norway, like the way their press works, like they just have an accountability board, and it's run by academics and journalists and different entities, and it's a pretty good, and they don't allow like advertisements, like they don't allow ads on like news and information. It's really interesting the way they go about a media structure that is best for the public.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, you see these countries kind of lead on a lot of different things, and it's kind of like, oh, this is what we should be striving for. Well, what would you say is the fix for all this in the US then?
Oh man, what a question.
I know that's a loaded one, but
Yeah, I think what we run into is that like for me, so much of that change needs to be personal change, needs to be equipping people with those soft skills, with those socio emotional skills to be able to handle like really what is frankly a lot of big feelings about a very sensitive subject for most of us. I think when I hear people get really up in arms about sex, about gender, what is happening is actually there is a threat to sort of their sense of self. Right? If we've established this concrete idea of this is who I am and this is my worth and this is what I will be given by the world if I play by the rules. And if those rules are hierarchical, if that worth is dependent upon us being more or less dignified, important, whatever than somebody else, when ideas come along that shake that, perhaps that suggests that the world might be more amorphous than that there is more gray area to be mined than that, people are left with the sense of like, well, if that's not how I'm supposed to measure myself, then what kind of scale, what kind of test, what kind of framework am I meant to be using to know whether or not I'm a good person, whether or not I deserve good things, whether or not the people around me are good people who deserve good things. And I think that's a lot of what we see when we talk about especially like gender right now, and kind of like how we are moving away from an idea of gender being very concrete, simple, biologically determined. Even sex itself, like biological sex, is really a much more vast and nuanced and colorful spectrum than we talk about. I do not like to talk about like a male and female body, because what we find is that even that's difficult to define if we're talking about hormone levels, if we're talking about internal reproductive or sex specific organs, external reproductive or sex specific organs, secondary sex characteristics, like all of those things really do not present in two neat packages. And then if we're talking about psychological and emotionally, like what is masculine, what is feminine, what do those words even mean? I don't like those words anymore. I think that like we can, use them loosely sometimes. I'm not going to, beat down people's throat about that. But I think it allows us to bypass a lot of specificity. And I think specificity is the thing that allows us to be more self-aware, to grow, to accept new ideas or listen to new ideas and be able to be critical of them in a way that is respectful and responsible. Teaching people, I think, a sense of self that is not reliant upon these ideas of hierarchy and the outsider and the other. I think that's going to be a really big part of us feeling less emotional reaction and pushback to ideas of sexuality that are going to be more inclusive and, I would argue, scientifically accurate and comprehensive.
what does it mean to be sex positive?
Great question. So some people in the sexology space still use the term sex positive. Some people will use the term sex neutral. I like sex positive still because the argument for sex neutral is the idea that like some people are not going to actually enjoy sex. The asexual community is certainly on a spectrum in terms of whether or not they want to engage sexually, whether or not they feel sexual urges. There are lots of different identities and lots of different ways of walking through the world that kind of fall under that umbrella. None of those are wrong or invalid. And then, you know, people have different experiences with sex. A lot of us are sexually traumatized when we were young, especially people who are sort of more like feminine coded, quote unquote, in the public eye. Those people are going to receive a lot of sexually unwanted advances and attention throughout their lives. So I'm not someone who's going to say everyone has to be like, rah, 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 yes, let's fuck, let's have sex all the time. To me, what sex positivity means is that we have a fundamental respect for and understanding of the many ways in which sex presents itself in ourselves and each other and in our culture, that we are critical of that in a responsible and respectful way, but also that we're not coming at that from a place of fear, a place in which we are trying to avoid the dangers of that, or a place in which we view that to inherently be something that is dirty or wrong, or in which we are weaponizing that against ourselves or each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just interesting because you hear that term and it's one of those things. It will mean different things to different people, but it's I mean, based on your definition. So technically, the way you laid it out, an asexual person could be sex positive.
Absolutely. I think I've spoken to many people within the asexual community who would identify as sex positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think that if there's one thing that I understand the least, it is, you know, asexual. And just because like I personally can't imagine that, you know what I mean? But I had a friend kind of explain it to me, just coming from a place of curiosity. And they kind of explained it to me. They weren't asexual themselves, but they kind of like explained, well, usually like this is kind of a common thing where that community is coming from. And a lot of it was just, you know, there is still so much pressure around sex, even if it is stigmatized, that
100.
To just sort of have no desire in that world is actually very isolating. And that kind of okay, I get that. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Still can't imagine what it feels like, but
sure.
I get it.
In the lecture before the one you came to was our psychology lecture. So we teach sex through a biopsychosocial lens, meaning that like our sexuality exists at the intersection of biology, psychology, and the ways in which we're socialized. In the psychology lecture, we talked about something called the dual control sexual response model, which is this awesome kind of like sexuality model from 2006. Bancroft and Jansen are the sexologists who sort of posit this. Emily Nagoski teaches this, I think, in a much more comprehensive way. She's a more contemporary sex educator. And basically that model suggests that we have sexual accelerators and sexual brakes, and different things are going to hit the sexual accelerators and brakes at different times in our life, from person to person, all kinds of things. And so when we talk about the asexual community, I think something that is like the beauty of diversity and the beauty and the importance of having like equity, inclusivity, diversity in the way that we talk about any subject on the world, is that I think the asexual community invites those of us who are allosexual, which means that like we do experience sexual desire in a more aligned way with dominant culture. They invite us to kind of consider what our relationship to desire is, and how frequent that is, how static that is for a lot of us, the things that do or don't press on or push against that. Because there are plenty of people who will experience low senses of desire, who will feel shame about that. And if you feel shame that is imposed by an external force, can we just take that shame away? Like, is that the healthiest way for you to live that life, as if we just remove the shame from you? If you experience that shame from an internal place of like, I want more desire, I want to connect to my sexuality, that's a different conversation. And like, we treat that very differently, you know?
So when you finish with the program, what's going to be next for you? Like where do you want to take this whole thing?
Yeah. My perhaps problem is that like I, as you can tell by the state of my room, am a little bit of like a force of chaos in the world. There's always like a million ideas happening at once. Right now, the things that are on the central table for us is repackaging this and creating kind of like a show that we could take to colleges and like within the first semester of college, give students sort of like an introduction to, we're going to talk about sex in a way that feels fun, that feels playful, that feels silly, that isn't judgmental, that is presenting real science and real information to you without being shameful or judgy or hopefully too dry. And then, you know, you can continue to pursue more information outside of us beyond that. We have a social media presence. I like post some resources and links on that when I can. There's so many good books, so many good like papers out there that you can get for free. That's like the initial idea. We're looking at trying to maybe find like a residency with a small comedy theater in Los Angeles where I could teach like a new sex ed lesson basically every month or so with our improv team. Last night, my co-producer Andrew and I were talking about maybe like more like musical or like one-woman-y versions of this in which we can do some sex education like on cruise ships or like, you know, smaller like companies that might not be able to pay for a full improv team. Here's still a way to kind of get the information out there. The hope is, again, kind of like using art and using comedy as a pathway to receive this information about sex without it feeling like something that is scary and heavy and like difficult to engage with.
So where can people go to find out more about you? Where can they learn more about what you're building?
Yeah. Okay. So we're on Instagram at AP Sex Education. You will have to type the whole thing because social media platforms do not like to promote anything with the word sex in it. We are on TikTok, further exemplified by the fact that there we are AP SEGGSED, SEGS, as in like eggs, ed. Wow. Or you can email us at apsexualeducation@gmail.com.
Angeline, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Ron.
That was Angeline Mirenda. Check out all of her stuff. Music for the 1000 Podcast is provided by Andrew Saxon. Be sure to check out his podcast, the Baywatching Podcast, wherever you get your podcast. Leave us a 5-star review, would you? And please like these podcasts. Make sure you're subscribed if you watch this on YouTube, and subscribe wherever you get your pods. Otherwise, this is still a new show. If you want to support the show on the sustainability end, patreon.com/romplacone for a Give What You Can level. You get all kinds of cool content. You get full stand-up clips not available anywhere else. And we do a patron Zoom. It's a really cool hang with like-minded people. That's all for a Give What You Can level. Patreon.com/romplacone. All right. Episode 97. It's... You know, y'all, I really appreciate all the kind words about Lucy that I've received, all the messages, all the tweets, all the emails, and I know that some of you listening to this may be among the commenters, senders, etc. Thank you so very much. It means the world and then some. I plan to respond to everybody, and I will. I'm just taking my time with social media right now. You know what I mean? I'm just kind of not on it a lot for extended periods. And again, for those of you who were fans of Lucy, are fans of Lucy, or can just relate, you know, over on my Substack, there's an extensive piece. It's just romplacone.substack.com if you're not already subscribed. And we will see you next week. Peace. Hey guys, Ron Placone here. Take your own 1,000 challenge. No, you don't need to interview 1,000 people, although if you want to do that, go for it. Your 1,000 challenge can be whatever you want. Maybe you want to call a friend out of the blue once a week. Maybe you want to read a book every month. Maybe you want to start a different garden every season. I guess that might be dependent on where you live. Look, the point of the challenge is taking on an endeavor that enriches your life in some way, and it can be measured. And then, of course, you do it regularly. That's what 1000 is doing for me and hopefully for you too. The main reason for this podcast and every podcast I've ever done is to build community. So take your own challenge. Then join our Facebook group. It's called 1000 What's Your Challenge? ? That's 1000 What's Your Challenge ? And post about what your 1000 challenge is and the progress you're making. All I ask is that people be encouraging of each other's challenges. This is personal and vulnerable, so be cool. There's enough negativity on social media. We don't need to add to it. For those of you who aren't on Facebook, hopefully in the future we'll be expanding to places like Discord, Reddit, but for now, we're starting on Facebook. And again, that Facebook group is called 1000 What's Your Challenge? See you there.